All right, another talking head here. So if you got something better for your eyes to look at, go for it. But without further ado, my thoughts and of course a rant on the geometric labyrinth. This of course will be fairly Techter centric, but I'm going to start at a high level and then work my way down. So let's discuss geos in general. I think the concept is actually good. One of the things NGS needed since the Great Wall Tower in Alio were repeatable dungeons with more depth, and I think from this standpoint, the geometric labyrinths nailed it. I have had a lot of fun playing through the series of floors and challenges, and of course I'll put challenges in air quotes. Do I think geometrics are difficult? No. And I know this might sound a bit weird because when you stack 400% HP and 300% attack damage, it is inherently difficult. But when I mean difficult, I mean that it requires a certain level of skill to overcome the challenges you face. And from that standpoint, I can't really call it difficult. As an example, let's take the Divide quests from PSO2 base. I would say they were more difficult as a concept than what geometrics are. One reason is that geos have a high degree of RNG, which can literally end a run instantly. Even endless quests back in PSO2 allows you to get at least 1 or 2 laps in before it decided to randomly crush your run. The other issues with geos is that really it comes down to damage. Now, of course, every game comes down to damage, but geometrics essentially boil down to either having enough damage or having the means to do damage without being interrupted. Or, to simplify it, you can just fly around the map, forcing enemies to chase you off the ledge, resulting in instant death. This isn't really a challenge, this definitely isn't skill, it becomes very gimmicky. And this is where I feel like geometrics fall flat. Now I could go further in and dogpile on Force or even Gunner because Gunner technically does things that Force does just with twin machine guns. But there is a more subtle example that I want to call your attention to that might have flown under the radar, and that is Hunter's Sword. For those that don't know, Sword got a new skill back in the Redum patch, which was Sword Art Charge Avenger. What this allows you to do is, when you charge a sword PA, once it's fully charged, if you take a hit, it will result in an instant Avenger. When you couple that with Hunter Art's Perfect Parry and the Hunter Art Perfect Parry advanced skills, you essentially ignore any incoming damage while increasing your damage output through Avenger. So what you can essentially do throughout the floors in Geometric is charge one of your PAs, generally let's say Spiral, the one where you spin in a circle, doing massive AoE damage, and essentially just wait for any enemy to touch you, and you'll buzzsaw through that floor. And this is great for things like enhancers, where you can't damage any of the other enemies, you have to kill the enhancer, but just charge your sword PA, wait for the enhancer or some random mob to hit you, spin, do a bunch of damage, guard, and then repeat the process, charging your next PA, waiting for that automatic avenge to trigger. Very powerful, very gimmicky. There isn't really much thought that needs to go into it, but it is very effective in clearing these quests, especially at a high level in solo content. And that's where I think the biggest issue for geometrics, especially when we start looking at different classes, and of course Techter, is that brain dead tactics and abilities can overwhelmingly dominate this content. This content to some degree does not recognize skill. Though as I say that, I guess I could expand that and say NGS is progressively becoming a game that does not reward, or at least does not recognize, skill in general, which I think is becoming a problem. I want to call out Flauk. He's a great hunter main. You might have seen him from all of his solo content, his speed runs. But one of the big things that irks him, and I'm going to agree with this, is Hellish Fall. Because essentially, that is the new Wirelance PA to where you charge it. If you take 2 hits consecutively, it automatically avenges, doing massive damage. This is a weird PA, and I don't mean to get on a tangent because we're focusing on geometrics, but I just want to call attention to this because that PA is the complete opposite of how hunters are designed, which is not to take damage. So essentially we've gotten to a point to where don't worry about being skillful and using Avenger effectively. You can use this photon art, take hits, and do massive damage. Now, of course, there's a consequence of taking hits for things like Gigantics, which can be problematic, but still, that's the thought process that Sega is going down when it comes to design. And that gets tricky, especially as things continue to develop, especially if that becomes the trend to where we've designed something and then we're going to essentially walk backwards from that design standpoint and do something else. You start layering in things that don't align very well, and it gets very, very chaotic. Now, back to skill when it comes to geometrics. Another odd thing is that they've decided to ignore how the game handles scaling. And what I mean by that is, when you are in solo content for everything else other than geometrics, that content, whether that's an EQ or whether that's a world map, the boss stats or the enemy stats are going to scale to you, that one person. As more people enter the room, it's going to scale based on that. If you haven't figured out yet, geometrics do not scale based on number of players. It is by default set to as if you are playing with 4 people. You've got 4 people, that's where the game is set. If you've got 3 people, you're playing in content that is set for 4 people. 2 people, solo. So essentially, as a solo class, you are playing in a game as if you were with 3 other people. Now, I could understand that Sega was like, hey, this is co-op in-game content, and we want you to be able to tackle this at a high level via co-op. The problem becomes when we have the gimmicks, the brain-dead tactics, or classes that have a lot of power and a way to avoid interacting with the enemy, you're not really setting a challenge to where that class needs 3 other people to help it clear. As we've seen, classes like Fighter, classes like Gunner, Force, they can easily solo this content because they have the tools and the gimmicks to essentially ignore those quote unquote challenging elements. They just become a nuisance more than something they actually have to overcome. And so this is very troublesome because you're creating more instability. And of course, as a Techter main, we feel this the most. And that's unfortunate because Techter as a concept does very well in this geometric content. The issue becomes we don't have the tools. We don't have the damage. We don't have the range to avoid damage or avoid interacting with enemies. And there's things that we can do, but that comes as a consequence of the little damage that we do have. And we don't have many gimmicks to blow through certain floors. Granted, I could multi-weapon a 1-star wand rod and pull off the rod suicide method, where essentially I'm just flying around the stage, waiting for enemies to chase me and fall off the ledge. The problem with that is I still need to do damage because not all enemies are going to chase and you want to speed things up. So there's always this weird balance and consequence that affects Techter because essentially you can't have trade-offs when enemies have 400% health. So it becomes a bit counterintuitive and there's really nothing you can do other than pray for good RNG. And when your ability to clear is not based on skill, but based on how you can exploit the content and how well the content favors you, giving the floors and the enemy placement and all of that RNG elements, it's not good. Now, with that said, and I wrote about this a little bit in my previous video when I showed the Talus gimmick against Bujin, I do believe that Techter can S-rank solo. But once again, it's very RNG. You need to get the right floors. You need to be able to avoid enhancers. And when you're talking about 5 floors, that's a coin flip. The probability that you're going to get one of those long gauntlet floors, or B, you're going to get a series of enhancers, it's going to happen. And that's going to be very, very detrimental once we get to those S-rank levels. And when we mean S-rank levels, we're talking about 250% health. And even if you're able to get lucky, it's likely still going to take Techter 40 minutes to clear. And with that much uncertainty, it's really not worth our time. We're talking about, I need all of these things to line up, and at any moment, any floor, that plan can be ruined. So it could be the first floor, which is probably ideal because then your run's instantly ruined, you restart, or you could be 30 minutes in and then saying, yep, gotta end it. That's problematic. That's not great. It doesn't feel good. Ironically, I do want to call out the old version of Surging Impulse, the Jet Boot PA, probably would have been somewhat helpful. But of course, that's changed and now that's dead and buried. But once again, when it draw things into where these Sega design decisions are having long-lasting consequences, and I think geometric is just that content, especially for Techter, where we're starting to see these issues unravel. Fortunately, As it stands, there really isn't any in-game itemization in this content, so you aren't exactly held hostage here. With that said, I do feel like the current state of the quest is a bit punishing the further you climb. Now granted, I don't expect to face throw through this, but I do expect that the game encourages me to continue the climb. And it's very disheartening to where I get to 250 health, or excuse me, 250% health, and the game really hasn't changed from a challenge standpoint, but now it's a hurdle because I have to take down as Techter a bunch of meat shields, a bunch of meat sponges. And I'm just talking about 250% plus health without any of the other challenges. You know, no increased attack, no half health, no HP, none of those other challenges. Just increasing the health alone becomes a detriment. And it just feels like while I was very interested in trying to S rank, that simple change, that tweak, now just kind of ruins everything. And I'm like, okay, moving on. And the more I think about it, this is what's becoming my growing issue with the game. And that's Sega's wonky design choices that are impacting the game more than the nonsense the game itself might throw at you. You know, when you think of the game nonsense, it can be overcome because there's rules. There's things that you can do to exploit those rules or to turn those rules in your favor. But when you look at design nonsense, you can't. That's essentially hand of God level things. It's hard coded. There is no rule because essentially you're fixed to what that design allows you to do. Now, of course, this isn't all bad. For Techter, it's bad, but when you see things like Force and Hunter when it comes to the sword PA that we talked about, there are some advantages from these wonky design decisions. But as a collective, you get this very bipolar type of game to where things are just kind of random and chaotic. And what's the point? We should all just essentially play like 3 classes and nothing else really matters. And so hopefully this changes. We'll find out maybe next week in the next headline that's going to talk about May, which is likely just the other seasonal where you get your dark weapon, but then June. Do I think it's enough? Do I think they understand what's going on? I'm not sure. What gets tricky is that geometrics might not be necessarily the issue in of itself. It might just be showing what happens when the Sega's product roadmap or the NGS roadmap got pushed back. And we're seeing things getting fragmented. Maybe things will start catching up and starting to balance themselves out once we get in June. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts on the geometric quests. And of course, you can rant all you want in the comments. The next headline is right around the corner, so maybe we'll have something to discuss then. Other than that, I'll catch you all next time.